Hi, I'm Mary Hartnett, Executive Director of Clean Elections Minnesota. Welcome to tonight's program on restoring the vote, putting the new law into action. Clean Elections Minnesota is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization seeking a healthy and inclusive democracy. We educate and advocate for expanded transparency and reforms limiting the power of wealthy donors and special interests in Minnesota's political process. Our 13 co-sponsors this evening are the Restore the Vote Coalition, Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, MNCASA, Common Cause Minnesota, League of Women Voters Minnesota, Fair Vote Minnesota, Plymouth Area and Minnesota 3rd District, Congressional District Indivisible Chapters, Second Chance Coalition, We Choose Us, We Are All Criminals, Minnesota Council of Foundations, and Minnesota Voice. These nonpartisan groups have been working for years and some for decades in support of this legislation. Tonight, we all want to increase our understanding of the new law's purpose and how it will be implemented. Restore the Vote was passed on February 2nd, 2023 in the House, led by Chief Author Representative Cedric Fraser, then was passed by the Senate on March 2nd. And on March 3rd, Governor Tim Walz signed a bill granting the right to vote to non-incarcerated Minnesotans convicted of a felony. When the bill takes effect in July, Minnesota will join 22 other states and the District of Columbia in granting voting rights to people on felony probation and parole. It amounts to the biggest expansion of the right to vote in Minnesota since 18-year-olds were allowed to vote in 1972. We are pleased to have special guests tonight to discuss the bill and its implementation. Minnesota's Secretary of State, Steve Simon, and the bill's Senate sponsor, Senator Bobby Joe Champion, who also serves as president of the state Senate. Moderating their discussion will be retired Pulitzer Prize winning Star Tribune journalist and CEM board member, Dave Hoggy. Dave?
Hey, thanks, Mary, and thanks to everyone who's with us tonight, watching from home. Thank you for joining us. Special thanks to Senator Champion and Secretary of State Simon for taking the time to be with us as well. Before we dive into the specifics of Senator Champion's Restore the Vote legislation, I thought we might take a moment just to set the context of the 2023 legislative session. It seems to me it's been already a remarkably productive session, and especially with respect to issues such as voter access and participatory democracy. A number of provisions have moved or are moving. And I thought we might start, Senator Champion, if you could just tell us how you see this. What are some of the major breakthroughs, major achievements that you see moving in terms of participatory democracy in the legislature this year?
Thank you so very much for having me tonight, along with our wonderful Secretary of State. As you started mentioning that in the legislature, we've done a lot already when we think in terms of not just around elections, but, 100% clean energy, that work, the Crown Act, Juneteenth, tax conformity. We also made sure that we were being thoughtful about North Shore and unemployment insurance benefits. The list just goes on and on. As it pertains to your specific question, I'm not on the elections committee, so I'm busy in the chairing the jobs committee, but others. But I'm certain that Senator Carlson and the others would probably be in a better position by which to talk about some of those things outside of like automatic voter registration. That's something that I've been hearing a lot about because we believe that we want to make sure that democracy is real, right? And how do we make sure that we increase the number of folks who are going to be engaged in the election process? So there are a number of different things that the election committee has been talking about and putting forward. And probably our wonderful Secretary of State, who probably spends a lot more time in that area than I. But what I will say is that we've been wanting to make sure that citizens in this great state have an opportunity to improve their quality of life. And we want to do that in real time. And voting and our democracy is one of those pillars. And so I just want you to know that we are moving up to some of the major omnibus bills that are coming through the legislature, which will include an omnibus bill that's coming from our elections committee as well. So with that being said, I just think that it'd make better sense going to our Secretary of State to ask about some of the other reforms or democracy focused legislation that is coming through the process that he's supporting as well.
Sure. Secretary of State Simon, do you want to take a stab at that? What do you see as the major breakthroughs in terms of democracy and clean elections this year?
Well, thanks. First, I want to thank you. I want to thank Clean Elections Minnesota for having us. I want to thank Senator Champion, President of the Senate Champion, for being an extraordinary partner on these and many other issues. His leadership has really been tremendous over many years, by the way. It's not just something that he jumped into this year or last year or the year before or the year before. He and I actually served together in the House, and he was a passionate advocate on this and other democracy issues. In terms of this session, you know, I often like to say that I'm in the democracy business. And it is one heck of a time to be in the democracy business in 2023 in Minnesota because of what's going on in the Capitol. I don't think I'm exaggerating to say that in many respects, but certainly as to the democracy lane, this is the most productive legislative session probably in 50 years. And I say that because restoration of the right to vote, which is the main issue that we're here to discuss, is already passed, already signed into law. And I know we'll say more about that. But as Senator Champion rightly said, other bills that are on their way towards passage, fingers crossed and knock on wood, but they are being teed up to be passed, include things like automatic voter registration. They include things like pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. Things like election worker protection, which we very badly need, unfortunately, in Minnesota. Things like more protection for voters themselves, not just election workers, but voters themselves when they're the subject of harassment or intimidation or efforts to keep them from voting. So there are many issues, large and small, in the democracy sphere that are really advancing and making great strides this session. Those are some. There are others as well. But I think when the dust settles on the 2023 election legislative session, we'll be able to look back and say, this truly was one of the most consequential sessions in decades.
Great,
And,
thank you.
and if I might add on one more that I did think about, and I'm glad that we had a chance to start with our wonderful Secretary of State, because he is in the democracy business, and he and I were out talking about that all last year. But also there's a bill that says workers who want to go out to vote, that they should have the right to go out to vote, even if that's someone who wants to participate in early voting. Because we know that when someone wants to vote on election day, there's a provision that allows them to do that. But now that we understand that the election day is at the end of the election season or cycle, and we think that individuals should have an opportunity to make a choice to go out and vote early, and that employers should accommodate that opportunity. And so that's one of the things that I know that I've been carrying as well. And I know that our Secretary of State likes that whole idea, because we do want to make sure that employers know that if there's an employee who says, I want to take advantage of early voting and I want to go today and I don't want to wait until the end of the election cycle, that we want to make sure that they have an opportunity to do that.
Right. Great. Well, thank you. Well, that said, Senator Champion, let's move into the specifics of your legislation, the Restore the Vote Act, this historic piece of legislation involving the voting rights of felons. Could you just give us sort of a brief summary of kind of the key provisions of the legislation?
Well, thank you so much. I'm very proud of this piece of legislation, as I am other things, but I'm really proud of this legislation, because what it says is that here in the state of Minnesota, if we have a person who may be on felony probation, and if they're not incarcerated, that they should have the right to vote. Bright line, clear, simple, straight to the point. And most people will say, well, why is that? Because in the great state of Minnesota, we have long probationary periods. Right. And so if someone is on probation under Minnesota statute 609.165, it says that if a person is off paper or no longer on probation, only then would their civil rights be restored to them, which would include the right to vote, which would be automatic. Restore to vote says, hey, wait a minute, you don't have to wait 10, 15 years. Even a young lady who testified and talked about the fact that she was put on probation for 40 years.
Oof.
And that she'd be 71 years old before she would be eligible to vote.
Amazing.
And that was after she had what sounded like a drug addiction and did some things that she was not very proud of. But that was 10 years ago. And she still would have to wait until she was 71 years old to be able to vote. So Restore to Vote says, listen, we believe that a person should not be perpetually punished. If they are not incarcerated, they should have the right to vote. And if someone comes out of prison, the right to vote would be instantaneous, that they don't have to wait some waiting period in order to make sure that's happened. Well, why? Because we know that there are 55,000, up to 55,000 individuals in our great state, all around the state, who are living in our communities where a decision has been made about them being safe and them being in our communities, who before this passage of this legislation could not vote. They would be paying taxes, raising families, doing everything that you'd want them to do. And we know that recidivism goes down when individuals are engaged in pro-social activities, which includes voting. Well, it also includes getting a job and doing other things. We want them to feel connected to the community. So that's what this legislation does. It says to those individuals, our friends and families who are living in our communities, and by the way, that 55,000 that I talked about, 36% of them come from Hennepin of Ramsey County, where 64% come from outstate. So this is not just a metropolitan issue. This is a Minnesota issue. And so that's why I'm proud of it, because it's Minnesotans and we want them to be engaged and for their voice to be heard. How will we hear their voice? By voting. And so that's the bedrock of our democracy. I want to get as many people out and participating. And so that's what this legislation does.
Yeah, Senator Champion, you've made a powerful case for the benefits of restoring the vote in terms of incorporating individuals back into our society, participants in our democracy, participants in our society. Are there also benefits in terms of our democracy, in terms of strengthening the greater cause of our democracy, that we have expanded the pool of people who can vote?
Absolutely. When we talk about we the people, that we really want we the people to participate in who represent them on any level, whether that's school board, whether that's city council or our county boards or the state legislature or on a national level. We know that when individuals have an opportunity to participate in our democracy, that they feel more connected. It is about the greater good and the greater notion of democracy. We want more people to vote, not less. You know, there's someone who says bad officials are elected when good people don't vote, right? And so we want to make sure as many good people have the opportunity to vote. And I will say this, one of the arguments that I heard during the committee process and also on the floor, someone says, well, we haven't heard from victims. What about victims? We're constantly talking about individuals and their right to vote. What about victims? And in fact, a group like Mincasa and others stood up and said, we represent victims. And victims want individuals to be law-abiding and to be engaged so that they are no longer causing havoc on anyone else, right? And so this is really about not just the individual, but victims, our communities, and children. Because it is clear that children are mirror images of their environment. And when they see their family, if their mom or dad going to vote, they too will become voters. So not only is it the immediate opportunity for that 55,000 people, but we're also not just grooming, encouraging, modeling behavior that we want our young people to be involved in our democracy as well.
Great, thank you. A question has just come in from our audience. It's sort of a detailed question, but it has to do with how the law will work. And someone has asked, will the law apply to folks who are on work release so that they're technically still incarcerated, but they're in a work release program? Are they eligible under Restore the Vote?
We think that they will be and should be, and we're clarifying that because we want to make sure that there's no confusion. We know that that someone who's on work release could be on intensive supervision and out in the community, and we want that bright line to even apply to them. So we're in the process of talking to the Department of Corrections, also making sure if there's any cleanup language that we need to put in law, that we are certainly going to do that. Well, one of the reasons why that's important is because work release is a step towards individuals being in our community. And we want to make sure that they feel connected and that they too will see themselves not just perpetually by the decision that they made that landed them in that unfortunate situation. So we are working feverishly in order to make sure that we can clarify that. And we've been talking to the Department of Corrections, and we are certainly going to put forth any clarifying language that would be helpful in order to make sure that individuals who are out on work release are able to vote.
Okay, great. Secretary Simon, this bill has been described as one of the biggest changes to Minnesota's electoral system in 50 years or so. What's it going to take to implement the law? What does it take to notify the affected individuals that they have the right to vote, to make sure that they do feel embraced by our electoral system and can in fact participate?
Thank you. That is the key question, because we can't just sit back, just and only congratulate ourselves for having passed this and think the rest will take care of itself. It won't. Let me give you a statistic. I don't want to bury you in numbers and statistics, but this is one I think you'll find compelling and a call to action. In the state of Washington a few years ago, they did the same thing as we just did here. They restored the right to vote for people who left prison behind. Their number was not 55,000. It was a bit lower, about half, less than half. It was about 24,000. In the election, the statewide general election following that bill becoming law in Washington, with 24,000 odd people eligible. Do you know how many people voted in that first subsequent election in Washington state? You're not going to believe it. I had to double check it. 414. 414. I'm not suggesting that if we did nothing, we would be that low, because, hey, we're Minnesota and we're above average, right? But we got work to do. All of us, including people on this call. So one of the things that we have done right away is I personally met with the Commissioner of Corrections, Paul Schnell, with his senior staff. Our office is continuing to have follow-up meetings. There's a big one coming up this Friday with the Restore the Vote Coalition, with other partners. It's not just our office, it's community groups across the spectrum and across the state to reach out to folks. And to your question about how specifically we do that, well, one of the reasons the Department of Corrections is so important is they supervise what happens at the county level with probation staff and probation officers. So it's important that we get to them so that they can convey in very clear terms to people who are newly enfranchised what that means. We have money in one of the budget bills right now. We hope it's not changed or whittled down. It's a good chunk, a good burst of money for us to do public service announcements and other paid media and other ways to get out to people. That's another thing. And then there's something else that ties into more legislation. I mentioned automatic voter registration. That is going to be key to all of this, because we know that intermediate step, at least that was the experience in Washington state, we believe, and others there believe, that's the most important thing, that intermediate step, getting past that, getting people registered first, that can be a barrier. So once we pass, which I think we will, automatic voter registration, we're going to get those newly enfranchised folks, as many of them as we can, at least on the voter rolls. That doesn't mean that any particular person who's registered, whether it's a newly enfranchised person who's left prison behind or anyone else in society, just because they're registered doesn't mean they're going to take that next step and vote. But it sure is, it sure helps. Let me put it that way. So the combination of automatic voter registration, our and others' relationship with the Department of Corrections, and then getting community groups on board over the coming weeks and months to make sure we're doing as much direct outreach as possible to let people know of their rights. There's already confusion out there. And I'll just say, and Senator Champion and I, we can almost finish each other's sentences, because he and I were side by side in a lot of these meetings last fall and barnstorming on these and other democracy issues. But I'll say that it's always heartbreaking because of the confusing system we have right now, where people are only eligible to vote after they're off paper. There's a lot of confusion on both ends. There are people who believe they have the right to vote back, because maybe they've confused Minnesota's system with another state like North Dakota, and they tragically risk another felony by registering to vote or maybe even attempting to vote. And then there's folks on the other side of that confusion that are likewise confused. And Senator Champion and I, as people who have done a lot of door knocking in our day, we both talked about this in different forums, how invariably every election cycle, when you go door knocking, every single one, every single time, there are one or multiple people. You'll knock on their door, you'll show them the literature, they'll say, great, you sound great. Unfortunately, I can't vote for you. And you'll say, well, why? What's going on? Well, I had a felony in my past. Well, are you on paper? Well, no, I've been off paper for years. Well, you can vote. That was the case even before we passed this. And so there's confusion on both ends. People who wrongly think before we pass this, people who wrongly believe they are eligible, and people who wrongly believe that they are ineligible when they've been eligible. Now we have, as Senator Champion rightly said, a bright line, clear rule. If you're in custody or incarcerated, you can't vote. The minute you are no longer incarcerated, you can. And that clarity will hopefully make the job easier. But long story short, we've got work to do.
Specifically, how do you notify people who are on probation that they have regained the right to vote? Do you have to work through the probation system? Do you notify individuals directly? What are the mechanics of that?
That is exactly what we're working on now. That's why we're having these meetings with the Department of Corrections. It's both and, I think.
Yeah.
It's both making sure that at the county level, the probation officers are communicating this information, and it's separate outreach, I strongly suspect, to individuals once we can get that data and once we can get that records. And it's got to be a team effort. It can't just be our office.
Yeah.
It's got to be the Right to Vote Coalition. It's got to be other groups reaching out to folks and making sure that we don't have the bad result that they had in Washington State, where very, very few people who were newly enfranchised actually took advantage of that.
And may I say something as well? The Secretary of State is totally right about everything that he says. And let me tell you why this component is very important as well. Because we have to make sure not just the correctional facilities, once individual is coming out, you know, there's a provision in this law that says, hey, you have to have someone there who notifies them of their right to vote, right? I believe that those public service announcements are very important. I also think going into you know, the bowels of our various communities in order to make sure that it becomes so well known, whether that's at a Juneteenth festival, whether that's at our Hmong, you know, first of the year, whatever it is, right? That it is such an embedded part of the fabric of our society that we tell people about this, because guess what? It's going to be your friend that you're talking to privately that's going to have to be the one to also remind people what they can or cannot do, because we know that individuals need to have this information. And in fact, to show you or to tell you or share with you a funny story, I remember when I was in the House and Secretary of State was with me then, and I remember the stories that he just articulated, because we knock on doors, and I had heard, you know, this over and over again on the elections cycle. You know, people say, oh, I'd love to vote for you, but you know, I'm a felon. Then I go through the whole thing about, hey, are you on paper? No, I've been off. And I said, well, you can vote. Then they would say to me, no, I can't. I would say, yes, you can. They say, no, I can't. I say, yes, you can. Then I would say, who's the lawyer here? Me or you? Right? Yes, you can. And I remember, and the reason why I'm reciting this story is because I remember coming into the House of Representatives and remember this, Steve, that I had a bill that said, we want probation and others, when individuals are no longer on probation, to send out to their clientele or their workload that you're no longer on probation so that you can vote. And remember, the House and the Senate passed it. Governor Pawlenty vetoed that bill.
Yeah.
When it was just what? About information, because knowledge is power. So we have to do everything that we can and with all of our strategic partners and allies to make sure that people understand what is now the law in this great state, and that we want to encourage people to get to the polls and vote.
Sure. So a number of other states have already done this, restore the vote to unincarcerated felons. What do we know from those other states about the experience, about whether it was hard to implement it, whether it in fact changed, apart from the state of Washington, whether it in fact changed voter turnout? whether it how it changed the functioning of the democracy and the voter pool in other places. To either one of you, Secretary Simon or Senator Champion?
Well, I have heard a little bit about how it's gone in other states. And let me say, by the way, Minnesota was state number 22. New Mexico followed us a couple weeks later as state number 23. And it's actually moving in a couple of states you might not think it would move in, Nebraska and Kentucky. Those are two states, very different political makeup and complexion in their legislatures than the Minnesota legislature. But I will tell you, just before I get to your question, fascinating alliances and allies here.
Really?
U.S. Senator Rand Paul feels so strongly about this issue that even though he's a U.S. Senator and not in the state legislature, he went and himself testified in favor of the bill in Kentucky. He feels that strongly about it, which I don't know if he's ever done that before. It would be, I think you'd agree, odd or at least unconventional if one of our U.S. senators came to the state legislature, not for an event, but to testify before a committee. I can't ever remember it happening. So this can't be easily and always pigeonholed in terms of this or that side of the political spectrum. But to your point, in terms of other states, my understanding is that after a rocky start in Washington state, they've taken stock of some of the mistakes by inaction, and that's gone much better. In the state of North Dakota, our neighbor, which has also a very different sort of political complexion than Minnesota, but they're very happy with their law. I talked with their longtime Secretary of State about it, and that has been on the books for quite a while. And when it was implemented, it was very smooth. On the other end, there are states like Florida. Now, just to show you how much growing and popular support this idea of restoring the vote has, in 2018, you may recall, this was put to a statewide vote in Florida. Now, Florida in 2018 was a 50-50 state. They had the beginnings of a recount in their governor's race. It was quickly abandoned when the margin grew, but it was a very close governor's race and a very close US Senate race in 2018. Very close on both scores. And yet when that vote was put to the people, 61%, it was 61-39 that same year in 2018 in Florida. But there, tragically, as some of the folks at this meeting might recall, the Florida legislature has done, to my view, everything in its power to interfere with the judgment of the people, doing such things as seeking clarification, or not, I shouldn't say seeking clarification, but issuing requirements that debt be paid off, for example, before people can get their right to vote back, even though that's not at all what the people said in the state of Florida when they voted on that. So I'd say that, notwithstanding the Florida experience where you have legislators interfering, when it's fully implemented the way it's intended to be implemented, it's gone really, really well. It's a bright line rule, as Senator Champion said. It's administratively really easy, and it is the right thing to do. Yeah. And more people are realizing that. Iowa, North Dakota, New Mexico, as I said, Nebraska, Kentucky, red states, blue states, and states in between. And that's good. People are seeing the wisdom of this move.
And we don't want this new law to be the best kept secret, right? You know, it's just around the country, you see that there's increased energy around it. And then you see those who will constantly try to interfere with our democracy. And so they will say things like, oh, we support it, but, and that same message tried to happen here. There are those who said that individuals should have to wait, and they tried to, you know, say which offenses a person, you know, unfortunately committed, and use that as a litmus test to determine if they should be able to vote or not. There are those who said if they haven't paid their restitution, they shouldn't be able to vote, but as soon as they pay their restitution, then they should be able to vote. And we argue that creates, you know, division amongst the have and have nots, and our democracy is not for sale, right? And so we want to make sure that, again, that even though that this information passed, and we see from lessons learned across our wonderful country how knowledge is power, and we do not want this to be the best kept secret.
Yeah. Well, let me ask another question, starting with you, Secretary Simon. What do we know about these 55,000 folks who are going to regain the right to vote? What are the characteristics? Do we know anything about their age? Are they urban versus rural? Race? What other characteristics do we know that potentially, I suppose, might affect the outcome of an election or not.
Right. Well, Senator Champion gave the statistic that I think is very important to always provide and to repeat. So I will repeat it, which is that 64%, close to 2/3, are not in Hennepin and Ramsey County. This is a statewide phenomenon, despite the arguments, at least implicit, if not explicit arguments by some of the opponents of this legislation. So we know that. In terms of race, ethnicity, national origin, that is tougher with any great specificity to pigeonhole or to identify. But let me give you some anecdotal evidence. And this is just one statistic. When you look at counties and you look at the percentage of eligible voters in a county, otherwise eligible voters who, well, now newly eligible voters who would fit into this category. If you look at all 87 Minnesota counties, I just looked at this on Friday, it's usually in the 1%, upper 1%, occasionally 2%, maybe in the mid 2%. There's one county in particular, Mahnomen County, which some of you know. Mahnomen is the only county in Minnesota of the 87 which finds itself entirely 100% within the boundaries of an Indian reservation, the White Earth Reservation. And there it is about 4%. 4%. So as a percentage, that is a huge percent. 4% or thereabouts of the eligible voting age population falls into this category. So that's a really big deal in Mahnomen County. Obviously not the big numbers of a Hennepin or Ramsey or Dakota or Anoka County. So that's what we know. I think we'll come to learn a little bit more. In terms of age, it really is, I would say, perfectly evenly distributed, but distributed as you might expect. But the geographic piece that Senator Champion talked about is particularly interesting and intriguing. And that's why I suspect we got some of the buy-in that we did and got some bipartisan support for this.
Right.
And if I can also say this, I think the Secretary of State is totally right about it, because when you think about it, one of the arguments that folks on the other side tried to make was this is only for Democrats to get votes from the city. And I, with a smile on my face and a glow in my eye, would always, articulate that stat, right, as to where the folks come from. And then on the floor, we had a map that we were able to ascertain. And then we had a breakdown of charts where whether you were in Dakota County or Hastings or Cass County, no matter where you were, where people were. And that was significant because, again, it was all across the state. And so it wasn't just people of color. It was also white. We had a large percentage of white, right? Because just from the data that I see, just by sheer numbers, right? If you just look at, disproportionately or the low, population numbers for people of color, right? But we had at least 2 Republican members who talked about, even though they didn't vote for the bill at first, talked about their one Senator Coran, who talked about his son, who was on felony probation and for a long time did not have an opportunity to vote. And even though Senator Coran made the misstep, in my opinion, to say, and when he talked to his son, he said his son said he didn't worry about voting. And I said, did you ask him if he worried about voting? Wow. It's easier for someone who is who has their voting rights to say no, someone else is not thinking about it. But he talked about how his son experienced something. Senator Barr, who talked about other relatives as well, or friends or others that he knew of that had some had a brush with the law and was unable to vote. Well, you have Democrats and Republicans and independents. You have folks all across the state, because this is a Minnesota issue. So we also got that data from the Department of Corrections and also from probation to kind of see where folks were all across the state, when we think in terms of those who are living in our communities on felony probation. So it's not just one group or another, but it is the fact that it's Minnesotans, and we're about democracy. We want them to vote. And so that is what I think is important to note as well.
Let me just touch on one last aspect of the demographics, because we have a question from the audience. Do we know anything about the gender of this group of individuals? Do we have data on that?
I would say from the data that I saw, and unfortunately, I don't have that data in front of me. Large percentage of them are men, right?
Yeah.
You know, because if you just, you know, kind of think about, you know, our system, but you had women as well, right? Some that never went to Shakopee prison, but are living in our communities. A number of folks who had had some chemical dependency issues, and so they have since been clean. So it's a wide, and it's a cross section of people. But I think the Secretary of State was going to say something.
Yeah.
Well, actually, no, I was going to go back. But I was going to go back to your point, Senator, about some of the interesting political alliances, which fascinate me along the lines of what I said earlier about Senator Paul of Kentucky. I had in mind another legislator who you and I both know. I probably shouldn't name him, but used to be a colleague in the House, and he's very conservative on all issues. I probably agree with this person on 10% of issues and disagree with him on 90, but he was really passionate on this particular issue. And for him, it came from his he's very devout and religious. And it came, so he said, from his experience years ago doing prison ministry, where that really had an impact on him. Now, he and Senator Champion, for example, who serve together now, probably don't agree on much, but they agree on that. And so I just find this, for that reason alone, but many others, really a fascinating issue, and a real opportunity, as we've seen in other states, like the ones we've mentioned, like North Dakota, like Iowa, like Kentucky, like Nebraska, an opportunity for people from across the political spectrum to come together on this.
So he appreciated this as another effort to help these folks re-enter society and become active members of our democracy and the society. Is that?
Yeah, for him, it was about redemption. And it was
Yeah.
about second chances. And that really meant a lot to him. And so he was making common cause with the likes of Senator Champion, with whom I'm sure he agrees on very little, but he agreed on this one.
Yeah. Senator Champion, let me change direction slightly here. Folks in Minnesota have been working on this issue for a long, long time, and with a certain amount of frustration over the years. Can you talk a little bit about why you think it came to pass this year, and what sort of organizing and so what sort of groundwork it took to make this effort successful this year?
Well, I think that's a really important question, because sometimes when legislation passes, and sometimes individuals don't always understand the history of it, so they just think we had an opportunity to blink and here it is, right? So for me, having the experience of living in North Minneapolis, being born and raised in North Minneapolis, and then having an opportunity to practice law, I've had an opportunity to sort of see a cross section of people who will tell you that they may have had an ordeal that came up where they were not seen in their most favorable light. And then the question becomes whether they should be perpetually punished because of that decision. Isn't there a way for them to be reintegrated back into society? So even before I was elected in 2008, you had, believe it or not, our Attorney General Keith Ellison carried this bill before me. And he was in the House, and the Senate author was Linda Higgins. Yeah. Who I succeeded in the Senate. And just think of all the other folks even before Attorney General Ellison and also Linda Higgins who carried this bill, because it's always been important. We've always had people who were put on the margins of life, who may have done something that they were not proud of, who would find themselves engaged in long probationary periods, and where they were taxpayers and they were getting their life together, and they were no longer able to even decide who should represent them on the school board. Yeah. Well, and with all the history of work on it, what do you think pushed it across the line this year? Was there a shift in Minnesotans' attitudes about this, or was there a development in the way you organized and planned for this? I think it has been the constant drumbeat of talking about it, expanding the discussion, answering some of the questions that people may have had. I think there's been that shift in understanding across our state as well, that others now have a better sense and a better understanding as to, what it means to give someone a second chance. What democracy really means, because if you look at it on a statewide level, we've seen some close, elections at times, or times when individuals felt as if their vote didn't count and didn't matter, right? And there were plenty of opportunities where we would see individuals that would try to discourage and stop people from voting, and we just didn't believe that that's the way our great country should operate, that we should give people an opportunity to vote so that we can hear from a cross-section of folks. So I think with the trifecta, I think it was just a perfect time by which now to push it across the finish line, and not be bound by some of the other provocative things that people were saying, because whenever people don't want you to vote for something, they always use the worst examples instead of everyday examples as well, right? They talk about murderers. Well, 95% of people who are incarcerated are going to come out, right? May not be that murder. Maybe that murderer does come out years and years later, but they too, if we could trust for them to be in the community, then we should trust that they should have an opportunity to vote, right? And so I think people started understanding that individuals just being provocative, and that we needed to concentrate on democracy and inclusion. And I think now that we had a governor who was willing to, sign a bill, we had a House who was willing to do it, and a Senate that says, hey, it is now time. And so I'm just happy that we are living in this moment and living at this time where we have an opportunity to make sure that our family and friends are able to vote.
Sure. Great. Thank you. Well, it's almost 7:45, and I think at this point we'll switch over to questions from the audience. We're getting great questions. Secretary Simon, let me come back to you here. We have a bunch of questions about how the law will be implemented, and clearly some questions from people who are really well informed. They know more about the probation system than I do. So someone has asked, will the law apply to all three probation systems? I assume that's state, county, and local?
The answer is yes. That's the
Okay.
short answer, is yes. And in terms of implementing that, it's about getting to different people at different levels. The Department of Corrections is surely the best starting point, but we know that's not the ending point. So the short answer is yes. But again, we have a lot of work to do to get to those folks. It's not just those folks, it's the people who are dealing with them on a regular basis. And that's going to be our mission. That's our charge over the next coming months.
Sure. Where will these folks vote, and how will they know where they should go to register to vote? Does it take establishing a permanent place of residence for this?
Well, in Minnesota, when obviously you have to register first, but voter registration, just to take the mystery out of it, is really only any eligible voter, whether it's newly enfranchised or anyone else. It's two things. You got to show that you are who you say you are, and you live where you say you live. That's it. That's all that voter registration is. And if you go to our website, which is mnvotes.gov, you can see the long list of items that any voter or would-be voter can use to register to vote and to prove one or both of those things. Now, remember, we're approaching a time here, we hope sooner rather than later, when we're going to have automatic voter registration. Not every single person will be automatically registered. It's only going to apply to limited instances of interactions with government, like getting or renewing a driver's license, for example. But we hope in the years to come to expand it to other kinds of interactions. But that's going to help a lot in terms of getting people registered. But yeah, like any eligible voter, whether it's newly eligible or eligible for a long, long time, it's really showing those two things. You are who you say you are, you live where you say you live. And interestingly, in Minnesota, there is no requirement. I mean, you could be someone experiencing homelessness and not have a fixed permanent address. Fortunately, we were one of the very first states in the country in the early 1990s to pass legislation allowing anyone who is eligible to vote and can show the two things I mentioned, regardless of whether it's a fixed permanent address, to vote.
Right. I did want to circle back to one larger question. We have a couple more from the audience that are really good, but before we go to those, Secretary Simon, I wonder if you could say just a little bit about how Minnesota will now compare to other states. If we think about the map of the 50 states on these broader issues of restoring the vote for ex-felons, of voter registration and automatic registration, on the full gamut of voter access, clean elections, full democracy. How are we doing? In Minnesota, we're accustomed to being better than everybody else on this sort of
Right.
thing. Where do we stand on these issues now?
We're already in a very good place. I think we're going to be in an even better place at the end of this legislative session. You know, one of the things I'm particularly proud of is there's a highly respected operation out of MIT that does something every 2 years called the Elections Performance Index. You can go look it up, Elections Performance Index, and they rate states on a number of criteria. I think 15 or 18 or 20 different criteria in terms of just that, election performance, including access, and it's heavily weighted towards access. And Minnesota was number 2 for the last 2 times. I think Vermont was number 1 one of those 2 times when we got the silver medal, and I think North Dakota was number 1. I think in part due to the fact that North Dakota is the only state in the United States not to have voter registration. They have something like it, but they don't really have voter registration. So the point is, I think we're in very good shape right now, but we'll be in even better shape after we pass these laws. And that's been the Minnesota tradition. You know, going back to 1973, 50 years ago, Minnesota was one of the first states in the country to pass same day or election day voter registration. We were a pioneer. And again, we're finding ourselves pioneers in many of these other areas as well. That's been our tradition, no matter who's in charge, no matter what political party. And I always say that one of the reasons we have such sky-high turnout in Minnesota, no matter who's in charge, no matter whether we're tilting red or tilting blue, is that people know and understand that our system is fundamentally fair and accessible and honest. And that accounts for the confidence that gives rise to this great turnout.
Sure. We've had 2 or 3 questions from the audience, basically asking, how can we as citizens help implement this law and make sure that it's successful? We've had some folks who are asking about faith institutions. How can they work through their faith institutions? We've had a couple of members of the League of Women Voters asking how the League can help. Senator Champion, do you want to take a stab at that, about how the people in the audience tonight can actually help make this law a success?
You know, number one, thank you. I think that's a great question, because I think that embraces what our Secretary of State has said. It's going to take all of us, right? It's just not coming from his office alone, and it's not just coming from my office alone. One, our faith-based institutions across our state are great vehicles by which to have opportunities to talk about restore the vote, what that means. Because the more our friends know about it, they can share it with others, right? And so whether that's at your mosque or synagogue or your Baptist church, whatever, right, be intentional about it. Don't just think just because it's passed now, everyone knows. In the community, there are tons of opportunities for information to be distributed and talked about at community events, because there you'll get a different demographic, or you might see someone else who may have been at your local church or your local faith institution, and now they're in the community. And guess what? Reinforcing a message and making sure that you're being very intentional out in the public is great. Radio, PSAs, you know, or individuals taking upon themselves to write the editor in their local paper or a widely distributed paper. I think that's important, especially with like radio. You have friends, you know, on radio personalities. I do it with Camel J and KFAI, you know, be very intentional about shows and ask them to talk about this important work. And then guess what? We all have access to social media platforms. Whether that's Instagram, Facebook, anything that you have, you can sometimes take, you know, you can do tweets, you can do a number of different things to keep putting that information out there, or even sharing the information that we get from the Secretary of State's office or from some other trusted source that talks about this law and how it benefits all of us, right? So those are just ways I think that we do it. And last but certainly not least, how about with our own families? When you're sitting at dinner,
Yeah.
and you're whether it's I went to a Passover a Seder the other day. Those are just great opportunities to talk to our family and friends about also the rich tradition of our culture, but also we also talked about what we're doing in the legislature. Everybody wanted to know, well, what's going on there. It just was a wonderful opportunity, but it just shows how our friends and our family can come together and each one teach one. And I think that's how we continue to make sure that we widely distribute the information out in the marketplace.
Would it help for individuals who want to help with this to actually go to their local probation office and volunteer or make sure that the law is being carried out as you intend? Or should we leave that sort of to the corrections folks?
Well, to me, I think you can leave that to the correction folks because we trust that they're going to do everything that they need to do. We need to fill in the gaps and places where probation is not going to go, right? Because we trust that a person who may be on probation may go to, may read social media stuff or may listen to the radio, just filling in the gaps with information. And I think our wonderful secretary was going to say something, Secretary of State.
Sure.
I was just going to say, as we
go ahead. Yep.
thank you. As we stitch together this broad coalition on the implementing side, which is far easier to do now that Senator Champion and others have done their excellent work of assembling this coalition on the legislative side, it will be possible, I think, for us to plug in individuals where it might make sense. And I don't want to speak for any other member of this coalition, but the Restore the Vote Coalition, which is a sponsor of tonight's event, groups like Isaiah, groups like We Choose Us, which is a new but very powerful and effective coalition of religious and other groups coming together for bills like this and others. So I don't mind giving out my work email. And if there's anyone on this call that wants in the coming weeks or months to know, well, what is an organization that I could reach out to be a part of in terms of implementation, I'll give it out right now. My email at the office is steve.simon@state.mn.us. So if next week, next month, a few months from now, you're wondering, hey, I and someone else, we want to get involved, all of us can help plug individuals into efforts that are then ongoing. We're at the ground floor right now, but I think we'll know more in the coming weeks and months. That's steve.simon@state.mn.us.
All right. Okay. Just before we close, two more detailed questions I should have asked at the beginning. When does the law take effect, and will every individual be notified as part of the out processing process when they leave incarceration?
So right now we are looking to move the date up because right now I think it's July or something like that.
July 1st.
July 1st, but we want to move it up to like June 1st, or if not before then, because we know that there are some special and some local elections coming up that we want folks to be able to take advantage of. So that's something that we're doing. Number two, we are trying to widely distribute that information as much as possible in every way, even on the Secretary of State's website and other websites, that we're asking individuals to make sure that they have that information available for public consumption. And so that, I hope that answers your question.
Sure. We have about 4 minutes left. Senator Champion, I'm just going to turn it over to you for final words. Is there anything we haven't asked you about tonight, or anything you want to talk about the significance of this to building Minnesota a stronger democracy?
Well, first of all, let me just say thank you to everyone who's on the line, and even those who are not on the line, those who worked so hard over the years for us to all join together as a broad coalition with an intentional strategy to restore the vote. And I tell you, it's been refreshing to work with a cross section of people and to have those rooms filled with supporters and those who were not there. Positive emails coming forward, just reminding us as legislators the importance of this. But at the base of it is talking about our democracy and how we can continue to build on that and really perfect our union in a way that is in a way that we all can be proud of. So I want to first of all just say thank you to the League of Women Voters, for an example, Restore the Vote Coalition, Isaiah, others. I don't want to name any individuals because guess what happens? You forget someone and then you go, oh man, why did I say that? But whether it's this or even when we banned the box or when we did those things in order to make sure that we understand the importance of second chances. And to me, we need to always have the lens on of how do we improve the quality of life for Minnesotans. And that sometimes means giving people not just a second chance, but another chance because they're worth it. And our democracy is worth it. So thank you so very much. And thank you for all your rich questions. And thank you to Kim Peterson, who I like to always harass all the time because he was so thoughtful when I was at the Attorney General's office, as well as our Secretary of State, who's wonderful. I tell you, he really is in the democracy business. And no matter where we went, he talked about democracy. And we were joined at the hip because we really do believe in our democracy and the contributions that we can make to make it stronger.
Great, thanks.
So thank you.
Secretary of State Simon, any final thoughts?
Yeah, quickly, I just want to thank Senator Champion because I've been talking about this for a long time. He's been talking about it for a longer time. He and I served together in the House. And I can tell you, he was someone who took on this issue when it was considered a real long shot. And the idea of positive change and organizing for positive change could find no better example than him and this issue. You keep at it, you keep at it, you keep at it, you chip away at doubts, you find inventive ways to get around the hurdles and the impediments. And look what we got, a history-making law, as you said at the beginning, probably the single biggest act of enfranchisement in Minnesota since the voting age was changed from 21 to 18. Lastly, I just want to say, thanks to Clean Elections in Minnesota for sponsoring this event. And more than that, thanks for your excellent work. I've been around this a long time. I was in the legislature for 10 years. I've been in this job for 8 years. And I have to say, this organization, your organization, has taken off like a rocket ship in the last few years. And that's thanks to a lot of people on this call. You are everywhere. You're in the halls in the legislature. You're testifying in committee after committee. There's a buzz about the work that you're doing. And I just want to thank you for that because I could use all the partners I can get in the democracy business, and you've been a respected and effective voice this year, and I know you will for years to come.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the kind words. Thank you for joining us tonight. Senator Champion, thank you for taking the time to be with us and for your work. And to everybody who's watching tonight, thank you for joining us on behalf of Clean Elections Minnesota, and we'll see you soon.